Hello, welcome to this session. I'm Simon Verstraeten, I'm at ZFX, and here today I wanted to talk with you about getting started with Houdini Engine for Unity. So what is Houdini Engine? How do we use this? How can artists use this? And try to build some interesting things here. So this session will be basic, and I will show you some basic concepts and ideas. So what I will show you in the next couple of minutes is three main things. So I will first of all just immediately jump into Unity and show you how we can just use our Houdini tools. So this is over the perspective of an artist. So an artist just immediately can start building things. And then the next bigger topic that I want to talk about is actually then building these. Like how do I make some basic Houdini tools and use them in Unity? And then the last thing to talk about is all a bit more on technical side, like how do I get everything installed correctly, how do I get the license, and so on. So let's jump in immediately into creating procedural assets for artists. I want to also use this from an artist perspective, so we're not immediately going to touch a lot of like Houdini things or procedural things. We're just going to use a tool that's built for someone like an artist. And to do that, we're also going to use the Unity Starter Kit, which is something you can actually download right now if you're interested. So it's available on sitefx.com, and you can download a couple tools to try it in your project as well. So let's now jump into Unity. Here in Unity, I have a small demo scene. So this scene is a stylized scene, and it's built with procedural tools. So there are some tools that I'm going to show you right now that I've actually used in building this. As an artist, what are things we're going to have to build is, for example, trees. So in here we have multiple trees, and what we could do is we could use a tool for that to speed up that workflow. So if I now go to my project here, and if I look for a tree tool, I can now drag and drop this here on the spot, and it will actually warm up and then generate the tree. So here we go. Let me hide it for a moment back again here. So we have this tree now here available. It's a pretty large tree. And this is my basic results that I get out of the box with the tool. So of course, Houdini Engine that you see here, which is the plugin, you also need to have that installed and available. And once you have that installed and available, you can basically drag and drop in the assets, and they will work if they are built in a way to output something by default. Now, with this, we can actually already, if we enable here the gizmo, we should be able to see a curve here. And this curve, we can actually edit the curve. So if I click in editing mode now, I can move around the point. So if I grab the point and move that around, I will now be able to change and influence that tree. So I can control and manipulate how I would like to see this tree in my scene. So this can be used to generate also multiple versions of the tree. So that's a very interactive way of creating this. So it's not only like, for example, here on the side, we have parameters, which will of course most of the time be here, but we can also have something like a curve to have an interactive way of working. Now, jumping now to our parameters, we have a couple of them. So here we have the growing iteration. So they're now set to 3. We can also do 2. It will change a bit, but 3 is a good choice here. We also have then some resolution settings. So this will be the amount of polygons we will have on the branches. We can, for example, make the branch a bit thicker. So we have like this. But we can also make it back smaller quickly. We have then some options for the leaves. But we also here have a special tab for branches. So if I now open all of the settings here, we have lift, we have twisting, we also have the growing area, for example. So let's say I want the growing area to start lower. So if I lower this number, you'll see that the tree will now start from a lower point. So if I increase that back again, it will start from a higher point. So this can be very useful to play around with. You can also just type in a number like 0.2. And then you have something like this. We can also have, for example, the angles of the branches. So each branch can either grow a certain angle. So we can play around with that. So we can increase that, lower that. So we have different results. What is also interesting to play around with is then the lift. This will also have some influence on how the branches behave. So as you can see, if I increase this, the branches will actually come closer to each other. If I lower this, the branches will go a bit more wide. So we have that result. So this is a quite basic tree generator. We also then have settings for the leaves. So by default, it's this low poly style, which of course works for my scene. But we also here have a different leaf. So here we have the branches, but we can also have a leaf card, so plain cards. And then we need to fill in a proper material here that works with that. But in this case, for my scene, I only use the low poly style. So we can play around with that. We can have some seed variation, which is a bit more subtle. We can have the scaling, the amount of polygons, some deletion, some percentage reducing. So we can play around with that until we have a nice tree. So the process now, once we have a tree, what we do is we go to the baking options, and we can bake this to a prefab or a game object, just a basic mesh asset. So we have two options here to do that. And once we do that, we just then basically have normal models. So we just output models here. If I go to my models here that I have, so then we just have a basic model like this. So I did not bake this to prefab, just to model. And then we can have something like this. So this is extremely useful to build the scene. And another tool that I've used was, for example, for the plants here. So this was done by the foliage tool. So if we go back to my tool collection here, and if I look now for my foliage tool, and by default, it's going to output a single leaf. So it's not going to output anything like impressive, like the tree did, like the tree immediately gave you a tree. But with this, we actually just have one single leaf. So the reason for that is the foliage tool can be used in two ways. So either we generate a plant or we generate a ivy. So the plant mode is basically scattering around this leaf and making it into a plant or something like it looks like grass, for example. And then the ivy mode basically means that we're going to scatter that leaf on an object. So it's sort of like as ivy growing up on an object. So for example, let's try to recreate this one over here, recreate that plant. So one of the first settings to play around with is, for example, the length. Let's say I want it to be a little bit longer. And we can also increase the divisions if we want to. I'm going to just leave it. And the width is also very interesting here to boost a bit that width here. And we can also change the curve. So this is a ramp. So this is the actual shape. So if I play around with this, we can see that the shape will change. So we can also, for example, do this. So we have that. We can make something like so. And let's scroll down. We also have bending options. As you can see, like this is actually being bent. So if I were to play around with that, you can have different types of bending that we can apply on this thing. So maybe we can make it a bit more curling, like so. Maybe the width should be a bit higher, so I can always go back, increase the width until we have something like this. And let's go back to the bottom settings. Then I have an option here for cuts. So the leaf has these cuts on the side. So I can, for example, increase that, so the amount here. So we will have more of them, but maybe you want less of them. You can quickly change that. Then we have some final tweaks, which is basically poly reducing, adding normals, or adding a color, gradient color. So once we are done with our leaf, we're going to switch then to the plant mode. So we're going to click on plants, and you will see nothing appear. So we can also switch here to my plant tab. And what we have to do here is we need to add clusters of leaves. So I'm going to click the plus icon, and now we will have this cluster of these leaves. So now we can say how much leaves we want. So let's say we want like 7 leaves of these, like so. And then we can also say the position, some random rotation, the scaling of them, so they could be a bit bigger. And we can also like rotate them a bit more downwards. And we can, for example, then add another cluster. So this is something which is with iteration, so we can add clusters on clusters. So as you can see, I'm adding another one, maybe add a bit more, maybe add some random rotation again, and then repeat by adding more. Maybe we can lift this one up. Maybe these are like smaller ones. Maybe rotate them. Maybe there could be more of them, like so. And then we have a plant like this. So the cool thing here is we can always go back between the leaf modes, or you don't even have to switch between plants and leaf. You can, for example, stay in plants, and I can quickly go, for example, to the bending mode here, and for example, start bending this back again. So this will work quite easy and quickly if you quickly want to change the style or the type. So as you can see, we now have a different style here. So again, with procedural tools, we are quite flexible in how we are working. So we're not necessarily doing something destructive. This is often a process of going back and forward between what you have and what you want to see. And you can output many different results. So again, once we are done with this, we can bake out the result. We can change parameters. We can bake out the second result and so on. So we can bake out as many results as we want until we have something that we are happy with, or we have a certain amount that we are happy with to use in the project. So we have a variation for the game. And let's now jump into the second part where I'm actually going to create a asset. So I showed you now what sort of like the end product would be. So a single tool that someone can drag and drops in the Unity project, and they can immediately start working with it. They can immediately generate a tree, foliage, rocks. They can immediately use it in a scene to start making their scenes faster. And let's now talk a bit about some very basic ideas and concepts on making this. So this will actually be then in Houdini, and I'm also going to give you a little bit explanation of what Houdini is and how you can use it. So Houdini itself, so it's a node-based procedural program. So what that sort of means is that everything you do in Houdini becomes a node. If I want to start with a box and I want to then bevel the box, I will need a box node and a bevel node. So we will have multiple nodes that get connected to each other, and that will create a network. So I have a box, then I bevel the box, and then I will extrude the box. So those are 3 nodes. So every time I do a certain interaction, I will actually add a node to that network. So after a while, you will have a bigger network, and this will actually create a certain system or a recipe to create something in a procedural way. So just like the tree or the foliage, they have a certain system or recipe that follows certain rules that will give the final result. So once we start to build interesting recipes and systems, we can use them over and over again. So once I build a tree generator, I can always go back to that tree generator and use it in another project. I can open the tree, I can modify the tree for maybe improving it, making changes to it. So it actually is usable over a longer time, and it's very useful to have something that we can actually use in multiple projects. Now, interesting here with Houdini is once we have a certain network, is we can collapse this into one single tool, like you just saw with, for example, the foliage tool and the tree tool. So these are like one single node or tools that will do a whole bunch of recipe or systems in the background. So that's one of the key parts in Houdini, is once we have an interesting setup, we can create from that setup one single node. So in the future, I don't have to recreate that from scratch. I can just place that node that I made now. So with Houdini in general, what would the workflow be in the studio with that? Is we will first of all have a Houdini artist. So this is often a technical artist making a procedural tool. This can go from a lot of things. This can be like smaller tools, like a tree tool, a foliage tool. This can even go to like generating full worlds, terrains, cities. There is a lot of variation in between that. So once a Houdini artist makes a tool, he sort of like makes sure it's cleaned up and has a nice interface to work with. He can then now share this tool with the studio. And then everyone in the studio who has, for example, Houdini Engine for Unity or Maya or Unreal, they can benefit from the tools. So without any experience, they can just open the tools like I just showed you, and they can just start playing around with the interface created by the Houdini artist. So even one Houdini artist in your team can make sure that everyone benefits from the procedural tools by using Houdini Engine. So only one person can make or figure out the recipes of making this procedural, and then he can share the tool and everyone can just use this, drag and drop this in the scene and start generating things for the scene. Before we're going to jump into Houdini, I want to show you what we're going to build. So I want to make two tools. So I want to make one tool that actually generates a hexagon shape like this. So I can actually use this in another tool. So the second tool I'm going to make is actually a tool that can generate a hexagon grid for me. So I have a tool that provides the actual modular model, and then I have another tool that actually scatters that in the world, which is often a concept often used on bigger scenes. So we have multiple tools working together to build something bigger. So in Houdini now, I'm going to place a tube. So we want to use this tube to make that hexagon shape. So we're going to press tab and type in tube and press enter. So now we have the tube model here. So here in Houdini, what we have is an object layer. So currently we are in an object. So what does this mean is that we just place objects, but not really like modify them. Once we go inside of this object in our tube, we are now going here to the geometry level. And the geometry level means that we can actually modify the geometry. So that's always important to keep an eye out for. So our tube itself, if I look at it here, we need to change some properties. So at the top here, we have the primitive, but we want to change this to a polygon. So now we are actually seeing different polygons here. So if I tap W, I can switch between the wireframes. So as a hexagon shape, I want this to be, instead of 12, we want 6. So we're just going to change this to 6. So now we have an actual hexagon shape that I had in my scene. Now what I also want to do is I want to enable the caps. So this will just close the bottom and the top here. So we actually have a solid object without any holes in there. Now we also want to bevel the edges. So we actually have that grass and a dirt layer. There are a couple ways of doing that. So one way could be that we actually select the edges on the model and bevel them. So this is how we would often do it in other packages as well. So with Houdini, we can actually have a special menu. If you press now the C key, we have this radial menu. Now we can quickly modify this menu by switching here instead of the main branch to the poly modeling branch. So if we now press the C key, we actually directly have modeling features. So for example, I'm interested in using the bevel mode. So we can see that here we have this bevel, but I'm not going to use it yet. I'm going to first select where I want my bevel to be. So first of all, I want to be in the edge mode because I want to select edges. So we're going to press number 3 on the keyboard. We can also see it here on the top. So number 3 is for edging. And we just double click on one edge and it will basically then automatically loop on that object. So now I have my edge and I'm just going to hold the C and then go to bevel and release my C key. So it should create a bevel node here by default. And it will automatically fill in where this bevel is taking place. So this is not necessarily fully procedurally because we manually filled in or created this selection. And what we want to do now is set a distance. So either we can set it here with the slider or in the viewport. If you just click with your mouse, you should be able to have the bevel control. So let's create a bevel like this. And let's go into the interesting settings of the bevel, which is here the fillet options. So let's increase here the division. So we have here more of these wireframes. And we're going to change this also to a ramp profile. So we can actually have a ramp or a curve to control how this behaves over this edge. So you can see that we can actually create some interesting shapes. Now for this purpose, I'm actually also going to disable symmetry. So now the symmetry will basically make sure that from both sides, from here, from the top to the bottom, we have sort of like a quite symmetrical shape. So if I disable that, we will now have a less symmetrical shape, which is more interesting for my purpose. So I can see that this is for my top here. So I'm going to leave it like this. And this is then for my bottom. So I'm going to push this more. So this is my grass and dirt difference that I had. So we can play around with that. Like so. So we have something like that. We can always again lower back the poly count if you think it's too much. Can push this a bit more or less. This is just like a quite flexible way of working, where you're gonna have to just play around until we find something that you think is nice. So the cool thing about this is that we can quickly now also change this. Let's say I want this to be like a stone material, and maybe there's like a stone pattern in here. So maybe this can be a pattern, for example, where we have sort of like an interesting edge here. This can be quite interesting as a, for example, a certain floor pattern. So, but now let's put it back here. So we just have that normal shape. So with this made, we can actually now convert this into a tool. So we already made 2 nodes, but nothing is holding us back to already bring this into Unity. So we're going to select those 2 nodes and we want to make a digital asset. So there are a couple ways of doing this, but one of the common ways to do this is select what you want, and we're going to go here to assets, and we're going to say make a new digital asset from my selection. So your selection will influence, of course, what you will output. So we're going to say what this is. So we're going to say, for example, like a basic hexagon shape maker. Hexagon shape. And we can also, for example, say that we want to save this directly in Unity, which can be quite useful that it's directly also linked to my Unity files. So as you can see, now I have directly saved it into my Unity project. So I'm going to just press accept. And now this big menu will pop up. And one of the most important things to already know about this menu is that we can go here to parameter tab. And this is where I'm actually going to create parameters. So everything that I create here as parameter here in the middle will be seen in Unity as well. So now if, let's maybe just now jump in Unity. So in Unity, I should be able to see my tool here. So if I go to my tools, I should now here be able to see my basic hexagon tool. So as you can see, it's super basic, but it's already working in geometry. So we have the same geometry as in Houdini, now in Unity. So now let's go back into Houdini and let's create some parameters over here. So let's place that menu over here. And one of the first parameters we can, for example, take is the height. So the easiest way to make a parameter is to just grab either the number or the name and just place it down over here, and it will create that parameter. So this is now a working parameter. It's the same, for example, then for the distance. So grab the distance, and now we have that here. So only thing that we need to do is to press apply, and let's jump back into Unity. And now in Unity, I probably need to rebuild my tool, and I have now my sliders. So I have the height, so I can increase how high this goes. And I also have that beveling distance here, so I can increase that beveling amount that I made. So with a very manual setup here, we already have something quite interesting to play around with. Now let's close our tool menu for a moment, and let's focus a bit more on improving our assets. So I already know that the base setup is working, like I have the geometry working, but now let's actually focus on making this result interesting. So something very cool with Houdini is something which is called SideFX Labs. So this is a free tool collection that you could use. And this holds many different tools for many different use cases. So first of all, you need to install them. They might be already installed, but just in case if you have not installed them, you can go here to Window and you will find SideFX Labs. And you should click on that, and then you should either update or install the tools if you don't have them. So next step would be using a cool tool which is called edge damaging. So here, edge damage tool. So we can plug in our box in the edge damage tool, and it will take a moment for calculating. And now I have this result, which is a high poly count result. So for my edge damage tool, there are multiple modes. Currently, I'm only interested in the Boolean mode, so I'm going to click Boolean, and it will switch to a Boolean operation. Now, there is not much going on, and we probably need to increase the amount. So let's increase the amount of damage. And now we should see some little chips here and there from my model. So you can see some little bit damage here and there. Now, what I also want to do, since I'm working in this more low poly style, is actually lowering the resolution here. So maybe instead of 0.5, let's just lower that. And that might also influence here some of the damage done, since this is then also working with lower resolution. So this might reflect also a bit on that. So we're gonna have to play around with that. So we have some edge damaging here, which is very interesting. What is also interesting is with this tool is then the noising. So the damage itself comes from a noise. So if we change the noise type or size, for example, the alligator is really interesting to play around with. So if I now change this to a certain size, we can have different results here. So maybe lower this a bit more, like so. So we have something interesting going on. Now, the next thing to do could, for example, be giving this already color, which is also a useful labs node, is the gradient node. So this will just color based on the object size. So the bottom will be dark, top will be white. So we can change this, of course, to more fitting colors. Like, for example, I want dirt and green. So dirt and grass. So let's change this to a brownish color, like so. And let's change this top part to be, for example, green for grass. Let's bring that a bit closer to each other. And what we can also notice here is we have this result. So the reason we have sort of like this effect going on is because we are coloring actually the vertices or the points. So we are storing the color here based on the points here. So it's not ideal. Probably using a texture would be more useful for quality, but we now have to just play around with this until we find something like this. So we just start like on the edge. So now we have a very nice result. What we could also do if we're talking about the actual job tree that is created now is we can triangulate this, because this holds a lot of endguns and not everyone likes that. So we can use the divide node to triangulate this mesh. So just plugging it in should already do something like this. But I can also often recommend you playing around with some of these toggles. So if we enable the first two of them, we actually create something that might be more interesting for you. So this is then the model being triangulated here in Houdini. We can also take this a step further, and we can also just do a polar reducing step. So we can use our polar reducer of Houdini and plug that in over here. We can just plug that over here, and we can have a slider here, which is a percentage slider. So we can just say I only want, for example, 20% of the polygons, which will bring down the primitives to a better number for the game probably. And I'm still keeping that color here. So that's really nice to have. So again, we can maybe change things here around. So I can quickly maybe make the slider. Maybe we can change a little bit of color variation. Maybe make this a bit darker, more saturation, like so. Maybe here on the green, we can add some little bit yellow, like this. So we have some more interesting color variation going on. Then furthermore, what we can do to keep improving this is we can add a transform. And the transform is basically a transformation of the object. So either we can change the position, but what I'm going to use the transform for is the scale. So I can actually have a scaling slider in my tool. Instead of having to like manually scale this up, I can actually scale this up in a tool. So it outputs actually better scaling. And to wrap things up with our tool, I'm going to place a normal so we can calculate the normals. So either we can make it very smooth. So if we just smooth it out, the normals are smoothing, or we can just give this no smoothing at all, and every polygon is a unique smoothing area. So we can also use this in our tool. And the final step would be using an output node. And this is just useful to know that this is my output and nothing else should be seen as output. This is sort of like the recipe or the system behind this basic tool. And I could, for example, say that this is done. So what is now ready to do is to like finish up the menu. So we can go to my assets. So here we can go back to our hexagon maker, and this will open that big menu here again. And we can now play around with the sliders or expose more sliders. So for example, what could be interesting is, for example, a damage amount here. So we can drag that in over here, and we can now also change the name. So the naming here will be amount, but of course we want to make sure this is clear to the end user who will be using the tool. So we're going to call this damage amount, and that's done. Then further, we can also, for example, do a poly reducing. So we can drag that over here, and we can just type in poly reduce and press enter. So we have that correctly named. We can also then, for example, grab this ramp here. So we're going to grab the naming itself and drag it over here. And we can just say color of model, or I can call it something else. Just make sure your naming is good enough so someone, if you give this tool to someone, they will understand it. We can also here have then, for example, the scale. So model scale, and we can also have the normal. So we're going to grab here, and we're going to just say normal of the mesh. So once we have that all made, we can just press apply. And what we can also do to actually make this better is even bringing in folders. So we can actually grab a folder from the parameter tab, so create parameters, and we can create some folder structures if you want that. So for example, you can add a folder here, which is called, for example, for damaging. And I can, for example, now all the sliders that has to do with damage, I can put them under this folder. But I can also now add more sliders to this. So I can add sliders, for example, for the noise. So they are a bit more categorized. So they're not like, all the parameters are like a bit more in a certain structure. So they're not just thrown at you. So they're a little bit in a structure. So let's try this now in Unity. So in Unity here, let's click rebuild. And my tool is now being rebuilt. So back again, we had our basic sliders for the height and the distance. So we can always go back and make this a bit smaller again. I can play around with other settings that I have available. Like I can poly reduce, we can scale the model if I want this to be bigger. We can tweak that. We can do some more damage or less damage. We can also even just say like skip the damage, because this also increases the calculation of this object a bit. So we can also skip that. For example, very interesting is actually the switch node, which is often used to turn a certain feature on or off. So for example, here we would implement the switch node by just saying this is my first, this is my second. So now my switch node will basically be on 0 will be off and on 1 will be on. So we have two states of this switch node. So my edge damage should not be on all the time, for example. So I can now grab my select input and I can place it here under the damage. And then we can just say enable damage. And what is really interesting here is I can change the type from an integer to a toggle. So now it will actually be a toggle interface. So press apply. Going back to Unity, we're gonna have to rebuild the tool. And now this is my result. So what is actually happening right here as well is the poly reduce is reducing this a lot. So the poly reduce was actually mainly here for reducing the damage. So let me just quickly get that back. So let me just grab this back up to 100. And when I now enable or disable, we can now have damage controls. As you can see, now it is more of a process of giving this tool out to someone else. They test it, they give you some feedback, and you can now start to iterate and polish up this tool more and more and more. So the end result for this tool could be a variation of these hexagon grids or modular hexagon packs. And that is needed for the next step. So the next step will be making a tool that generates a full hexagon grid. So I already did some small pre-made setup for this. So what I basically did is I made two prefabs. And I also had a basic scene here for that. So in this scene, I'm going to use these two prefabs. So I have a prefab with a basic hexagon shape, and I also have a preset here with a tree on it, which I'm going to talk about more in a moment. So let's first focus again on the recipe, like what exactly am I trying to do, how I'm going to use this. So in Houdini back again, I can close whatever I have opened. I can go back to my object level, for example. And now this is my, inside of this object is holding my tool to generate these shapes. So what I will often do is just go back. We can give this some proper naming, like base hexagon. And now I'm going to create another tool and I'm going to make a new network for that. And often I would make multiple networks so things are a bit structured. So I'm not just making everything into one or making everything into like different spaces. So make sure you have some structure in tool building. So what we're going to do is we can also just type in geometry, and this will give us an empty geometry network. So if I open this node, it's an empty geometry layer. So we can create whatever we want without having any nodes here. So let's already first also give this a proper name. So this will be my hexagon world or tile generator. So I'm just going to go world. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to first maybe load in my other tool. So let's grab my hexagon maker. And now that's thinking about how can I possibly be making a tool that can scale up this and place them nicely to each other. So there are multiple ways of doing this. Like we, for example, could try something with the duplicate node, which will here duplicate the object like so. And we can here say how much of this duplication we want. So 2 or more. So we can duplicate this layer. We can, for example, do another duplicate node. And we can now, for example, duplicate in the other direction, like so. And then we just increase it like this. And this could already sort of work. There's also a simplistic approach to it. Now, what I want for my tool is sort of like a sphere or circle shape, and sort of it will expand in a circle shape. And what I found interesting to use here is again another labs node tool, which is called a disk generator. So let me place the disk generator. And you might see why it is interesting if we enable the wireframe. So the wireframe here is very interesting. So what I want is for each sort of point that I have here in my object, I want to copy one of the hexagon shapes. And that will sort of like make sure that I'm actually using or scaling a hexagon world in a sphere shape. Now, there are some few tweaks that I want to make before we can actually use this. So first of all, we have too many sides here. So we want to make sure that's also a hexagon shape. So we're going to have to lower the U segments until we have also a hexagon shape. Then next thing to do is we probably want to make this a bit bigger. So let's grab our radius here and let's just go to the max, which is 10. And maybe let's reduce the V segments here, which will have, which are these inner segments, to a lower count. Let's maybe try 5. So now we have this. So we have a basic shape of how my world should look like. And now I want to copy this hexagon on the points of my disk shape. So we're going to use a node which is called copy to points. It's a very useful node and often used. So it's in the word itself, so it will copy an object to points. So we're going to have to plug in our first object, which is the points, and then our second object is the geometry to copy. So by default here, it will copy like this. So I noticed that also my copying is in the wrong direction. And for now, to make it easy, let's just disable the transform using target points orientation. So it will try to orient the object along a certain information from this object, but that's not needed right now. So now we are very close to our result. So a couple of tweaks that I want to do now is place a transform node. So let's grab a transform node here. And I want to rotate my hexagon shape 90 degrees. And as you can see, 90 degrees is exactly what I need to have that nicely fit objects with each other. Now, what I'm currently now missing is if I now view my disk geometry, is the space in between. So I'm copying models on the points, so we only have points where these lines connect. So I need to find a way to create points in between the lines here. And there is a quite simple method of doing that, which is called resampling. So resampling is often used in Houdini if you are working with curves. So if you ever need to resample, which will create, as you can see, more points, which is very useful. So what it is doing is it is resampling or adding points based on a length value. So the average length or distance between points is 0.1. So in this case, I don't really want it to be 0.1. I want it probably to be 2. So let's press 2 and let's see what the result I have now. And I almost have the result. There is a little bit offset needed. And one of the things that can help with that is changing our measuring method to along arc to along chord. And that will actually make sure that everything works here nicely. So now I have my hexagon grid. So I basically almost have my tool. Like, this is basically what I want. So we can select everything back again, and we're going to go to assets, make a digital asset, and now we can make a tool. So right now, this is probably going to be named something like hexagon world maker. And it could also be interesting to directly use my Unity project for saving this. So once again, we click accept, we will have this big menu here again, and we can create our parameters. So what would be interesting to first figure out with my current tool is how can I actually scale up my scene. So if my outer radius is actually larger than 10, so let's say 20, my tool is not actually working nicely with that. unless this is the result you want, which could also be cool. So we actually need to make sure that our V segments is also being scaled up with that. So it needs to be at a certain number, and then it is giving us the good result. So if we take a really close look at this, we can see that our outer radius is 10 and my V radius segment is 10. So this is 20 and this is 10. So which is actually half. So if I set this to 10, then this should be 5. So this is sort of like the connection between those two numbers. So what we can do to quickly make this working in a tool into one slider, I can, for example, grab my V segments and I can say that this is the radius of my world. So radius of the world, which can go from 1 to 100. And when I press apply, which is now turning into a green box. So if I click on the naming, we can see the background information. So this small line of code is saying that we need to get a channel reference to, which is called the parameter V segments, which is of course referencing to my interface here. So if I copy paste this, so Control C, and if I now paste this back into the outer radius, I will also now here have the number 5. So I know that my outer radius needs to be the double amount of those segments. So I can now use a little bit of math and say multiply by number 2. And now we have 10. And the magic will already work if we go one layer back up. And now we have basically this result. So I can go from a very small world to a very large world here, filled with the hexagon shapes. So this is really nice. So let's keep improving this. So maybe going up to 100 might be a bit too much, since I'm not planning to make that big of a world. But what one of the next steps would be here is actually adding a noising step. So we're actually pushing up the boxes up or down to create sort of like a terrain effect. So what we can do is we can use a mountain node. So mountain node is basically adding noising here. So the actual geometry here, you can see that the lines are not consistently anymore. They're actually either going a bit up or down, which of course reflects into the placement of those objects here. So with the mountain node are some interesting settings. So at the top, we have two interesting settings for the height, so how high this should go. And we have the noising size, which is then interesting for making the terrain actually look a bit more natural if we increase this. So for example, like this. So it's not super noisy. What we often would do with the mountain node is going to the noise settings and play around with the noises. In this case, I also want to actually set the roughness to a lower value. So you can see that the roughness will add some more like smaller detail, which makes it very noisy in my case. So if I lower the roughness, it will make here like a subtle terrain. So maybe even boost the height more. So you can see a nice terrain. And now playing around with the type of noise will also influence a lot. So let's say we want to make a whirly noise. So we have something like this, or maybe another whirly noise. So at this stage, we are just basically experimenting with the noises we have available to see what works the best for my case. So you're gonna have to play around with it. But of course, we will expose this to my tools where I have a slider to play around with that. Let's talk about bringing this result now in Unity. So I have everything ready, but what I actually want to do is use the prefabs here. So I made these prefabs and I want to use them in my tool. So if I go here to my prefab, what we can actually do is we can right click and get a path. So we can copy the path. So just copy path and let's jump back into Houdini. And in Houdini, instead of using this system, we're going to delete this, and we're going to use which is called a point cloud. So we're going to remove all the geometry, which you can do, for example, with the add node. And you can say keep only geometry. And here you can delete all the geometry except the points. So this is what we call a point cloud, which is just points in the air, nothing special, just a bunch of points. So what is special now is that we can assign the path to the point. So each point holds information of what model do I need to copy on this point. So we can use this by creating an attribute. So attributes in Houdini are very important. And if you're looking into working more with Houdini, then you definitely should learn more about attributes, as they are very important with Houdini. So with our attribute system, we can now say that I want to have a Unity instance. So this is by default recognized with Houdini Engine. So what we want to do is we want to also change the type to a string value, so I can actually now type in the path. But in my case, I just copied it, so I can just press Ctrl V and I have my path to my prefab location. Then as final thing here again, we want to make an output node to make sure this is my output. And I'm going to click and select my tool. And let's jump into Unity. So now in Unity, if I now would grab my, so here I grab my hexagon world maker, and it will now output this result. So now it's just this basic bunch of hexagon tiles. And what is now special again is if I open my Houdini assets here in my hierarchy, I can see that these are all referencing back to my prefabs. This is my original prefab that I made. So I can now quickly scale this up or down. You can see that those are just prefabs, so everything is linked to each other, which is just very useful to work with. So maybe let's scale this back up. Let's go back to my scene. And now the tool itself, if we scroll back up, we have now our radius. So if I now increase this, we now have a large worlds. So the only thing left here is to create more parameters to play around, for example, with the mountain node. So I'm going to leave that up to you so you can experiment with it. And there's one more thing that I want to show you is I actually had multiple prefabs. So I had those two prefabs here. So we're already using the number 1, which is the basic one. But now let's also randomly place the prefab with my tree on it. So we're going to do the same thing as before. So we're going to go to my prefabs and we're going to right click and copy the path. Now inside here, Houdini, instead of using the create attribute, we're going to say create a random attribute. And in a random attribute, it will assign random values. So by default, as you can see, it will assign random colors to each single point. So what we can now do is we're going to change the method of placing random values to custom discrete. So custom discrete, we can also change that value to string values. So in here, we have now 4 slots to type in different models. So I only actually have 2 models, so I'm going to subtract this to 2. So one model is my tree, so I'm going to copy paste the tree one, and I'm also going to copy paste here my basic hexagon shape. Now the final thing to do here as well is to make sure we are also using the instancing name, so Unity instance. So now it is called CD, which is color, but now we want to use it instance. So I can now plug this in over here. So one of the reasons why I like to randomize it is we can also weight the value. So right now the models should be almost like 50-50 trees and 50 base hexagons. So, but what if I change the weight value now? So if I change this to, for example, 0.1 and just crank this up to 2, we will actually have a very small chance of placing now trees, which I think is a bit nicer than having a very dense forest. And now let's in Unity rebuild tool. And now we have these trees placed. So as you can see, now we have randomly a chance of placing trees. So this is again a very basic setup on a hexagon shape maker for this. If you are a bit more familiar with Houdini, you can also quickly get more interesting data and control more where should a tree be, where should other props be, and so on. So the idea here is that you could make more and more of these prefabs, or you have artists making out prefabs, and then you have a procedural background system actually placing around these in your world. So they are actually a nice, believable world built on these prefabs and so on. Then one of the last things that I want to talk about is installation and licenses of a Houdini Engine that you might need. So now I mainly show you a lot of things of how we can use the tools, how we can make some basic tools. But of course, you also need to go through the installation of Houdini and Houdini Engine. The basic steps on how to do that is you will go to our SideFX website and you will download the latest version of Houdini. So once you are downloading that and installing that, you will also have to be careful to make sure you have enabled Houdini Engine for Unity or other applications that you want. So make sure the Unity one is enabled so you have that available. So once the process is done of installing Houdini itself, so Houdini itself will always be in the background, making sure that a certain tool is calculating and then importing that into the game engine. But then actually for installing the tools, you will need to go to your installation files of Houdini. And under there, you will find a folder called Engine and then Unity. And in there is a package that you could use to install the plugin. So look for that package and then you can just double click on the package and it will install into the project you have to open. Then also Houdini Engine itself, there is some licensing involved, of course. So if you already have Houdini FX, Houdini Core, or Houdini Indie, then you don't necessarily need a special license for Houdini Engine. You already have that available for free. So there are also some other options. So if you have Houdini installed, like I have a Houdini version of FX or Core or Indie, then you should be able to find the Unity package. But you can also look on the website and actually find the Houdini Engine there, and you could also get it from the website itself. And also Houdini Engine Indie will also have its special version for Indie. For these licenses, let's get them a bit sort of together. So there are multiple versions of Houdini. So we have the commercial version, we have the indie version, we have an educational version, and we have a non-commercial version, which is called Apprentice. So with each version, there might be some things to keep in mind. So one thing can be that the asset format that you're actually creating might differ. So commercial version, it's just going to call it HTA. If we are, for example, using the indie version, it's going to call it HTA LC for limited commercial. And if you're using something like a non-commercial, it's going to call it HTA NC for non-commercial. Now, in terms of the Houdini Engine licenses, if your studio has for example, a Houdini Core FX license, then other people could install the Houdini Engine for free. The actual person who is creating and consuming the tools will have the actual core version of Houdini, and then other people in the studio, like the artist, would then be able to install the engine versions. And now we come to the end of this session. So I showed you a variety of things. So how to use a tool, how to make a tool. But from here, we can also keep more learning and build more tools. So I can recommend you going to the SideFX website. So we have multiple videos covering a variety of things. So if you go to that link there, so sidefx.com/learn/unity, you will find some learning paths that goes from basic asset creation to a bit more advanced, for example, to making something like a world or using PDG and so on. So that could be very interesting into your next steps. So that was it for me for this session. I hope you enjoyed it. So I hope you're excited to learn about Houdini and some of its procedural approaches. And thank you for your attention.